Welcome back. I hope you're all ready for session 2. Session 2, the topic is Peace by Peaceful Means in Borderlands. The time is a little bit after 10 p.m. here in Korea and 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. And we have moderator Tae-Yoon Kim. He's a professor and vice dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University, Korea. And for presenters, we have Dr. Severin Austisser, Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, USA. Also, Dr. Heidi Hudson, Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities, University of Free State, South Africa. Dr. Erika Weintel, Professor of Environmental and Public Policy at Duke University, USA. And also Dr. Oliver Richmond, Professor at Manchester University, the United Kingdom. Now, let me see if I can reach Dr. Tae-Yoon Kim. Dr. Kim, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. I'm glad you could join us.
All right, thank you. So welcome to the Development, Environment, and Peace Nexus, in short, DEEPEN, Peacemaking in Borderlands, and particularly the second session, Peace by Peaceful Means in Borderlands. So my name is Tae-Yoon Kim. I'm the Professor of International Development and the Vice Dean of Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University in South Korea. So this conference is organized by United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and People for Earth with the support from the Gangwon provincial government and the Cheorwon County government of Republic of Korea. So I really appreciate all the organizing the agencies for this wonderful event. I think the current border or territory of the state in developing countries in a historical legacy of Western concept of state since the Westphalian treaty back in 17th century. So its colonization and also the arbitrary demarcation of state boundaries for the sake of colonizers' interest. So let me take Africa as a main case for that. So as you know, the scramble for Africa began with the Berlin Conference in 1884 and ended by the early 20th century. So during this period of time, the European colonizers partitioned Africa into spheres of influence, colonies, and the various segments. So they partitioned the land from the European captors with the limited knowledge of the geography, history, and ethnic composition of Africa. So in many African countries, I guess the significant portion of their population belongs to the group split by colonial partitions. And also that this is true to Korean Peninsula. After 35-year colonization by Japan and the liberation from the Japanese rule by the end of the Second World War, United States and Soviet Union forced Korea to be split into two parts, and the Korean people still suffer from the forced division, which generated borderland between South and North Korea. So against this backdrop, this session is enormously, I think, timely and important to discuss the peace building and peace formation by peaceful means in borderlands through the various approaches and theoretical perspectives like feminism, water, peace formation from the below, and the international relation perspective. So in this session, we would like to address three key questions. Also, the participants, you can confirm that those key questions in the website of UN Research Institute for the Social Development and DEEPEN the website. So I just elaborate the three key questions. The first one is how diverse peace approaches conceptualized and practiced in the context of borderlands. The second one is how the everyday practice and norms and politics of those living and working in borderlands interact with the interventions of the state and state systems or international structures and institutions. Finally, what are the lessons we can draw from diverse cases of peacemaking processes in a borderland context, in particularly in a specific context such as South Korea, DMZ, demilitarized zone in Korean Peninsula. Now, I'm joined here today by a fantastic group, four wonderful, well-renowned speakers, who will share their insights, reflections, and life experiences with us. So after the initial round of presentations, we will have some time for questions and discussions followed. But before we start, allow me to make some brief announcements. Especially, I have some kind of housekeeping, things. So the first one is that the session will be, recorded and live streamed via, YouTube channel. So it will remain available afterwards. You can also find the recordings of the past sessions if you did miss them. So you will see that we have enabled comment section in the right and below. So you can leave your comments or the opinions, and also you can directly indicate one speaker or several speakers for your questions. And also you can use the likes to indicate your support for the questions, especially questions and comments. It will help us identify those questions and comments that most people would like to see in our address. So at the very end of the session, we will also share a link to a concise 3 questions, a feedback survey. So it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill that in. Right, so I just finalized all the housekeeping things. So now we have just go on the real the presentation discussion. So without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker, Professor Sabrine Otusha. Is it correct pronunciation? Okay, good. So she's now the professor of political science, Bennett College, Columbia University, US. So her topic today, he would like to address the front lines of peace, an insider's guide to changing the world. So Sabrine, you have 20 minutes to the maximum. So now, floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor King, for this introduction, and many thanks as well to the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development for organizing this event and for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for joining us from all over the world, especially because it's probably very early or very late for some of you. So the best way for me to talk about peace by peaceful means and to answer the guiding questions for this panel is to tell you all a little bit about my new book, which is entitled The Front Lines of Peace, and which will be released in a few months. The Front Lines of Peace is a book about hope. It's a book about the ordinary yet extraordinary individuals and communities that have found peaceful but effective ways to confront violence. And so to start, I want to tell you a story about this kind of people. It's a story that takes place in Congo, here, in the midst of the deadliest conflict since World War II, in a borderland area right between Congo and Rwanda. In 2007, a little boy named Luca was kidnapped and forced to work for a rebel group, just like the one you see on my slide. And Luca was so small at the time that he couldn't even hold a rifle. So his commanders would march him up front and they would use him as a human shield. Somehow, Luca survived, and after 3 years with the armed group, he was sent back home to his mother, Justine. But Luca had trouble assimilating. He hated school. He was often hungry because his mom didn't have much money. And he still believed what his commanders had drilled into him, that the only way to survive was to use violence. And so Luca spent his childhood running away to join militias. He was 8, and this was the only life that he knew. Meanwhile, in the United States, a young Indian American woman named Vijaya Thakur was working for aid organizations focused on Congo. And Vijaya was growing very uncomfortable with her work because many foreign activists used the traditional top-down approach to peace building, and they relied on outsider skills and expertise. And so as a result, they often ended up harming the very people they wanted to help. So for instance, most of them believed that violence in Congo was due to the illegal exploitation of mineral resources like coltan, which the men on my photo are mining. So Vijaya and her colleagues focused their efforts on getting new laws on conflict minerals, but the new laws cost the jobs of many vulnerable people like these young men. And many of the newly unemployed young men had no other choice but to join armed groups as a way to survive. And so whenever Vijaya traveled to Congo, she started asking ordinary citizens what they believed would lead to peace. And that's a photo of her doing just that. Eventually, she decided to try something in the village where Justin and Luca were living. She partnered with local activists and she organized lengthy meetings and workshops where the villagers would develop their own analysis of the conflicts they face and decide on what the best responses to be. And so the first step that the villagers came up with was for Vijaya and her fellow activists to give $40 each to a few women like Justine, who used the money to start small businesses like tailoring or donut shops of the kind that you can see on these photos. The businesses took off, and soon the participants had enough money to implement the second part of their plan. So they installed taps for clean drinking water, and they organized trainings for the teachers to learn how to curb ethnic tensions rather than fueling them. And eventually, they lobbied local authorities for protection and better services. Luca, he now had 3 meals a day, shoes without holes, and role models who didn't use violence to survive and gain power. And like Luca, all of the villagers were safer and healthier. And one day, Vijaya was talking with Justine, and Justine kept using the word success to refer to the whole initiative. It was because Luca had turned 13, and for the first time in his life, he was speaking in the future tense. He had stopped running away all the time, and he was making plans, peaceful plans within his community. He now wanted to hold a pencil instead of a gun, as Justine said. And so now you know where the artist found the inspiration for the cover of my book. As for Vijaya, she created the Resolve Network. And the Resolve Network has used this approach to help more than 7,000 people over the past 10 years. All of them individuals at risk of being recruited by armed groups, and more than half of them actually former combatants like Luca. So militias have formed and reformed in Congo, and the pressure to remobilize has been absolutely enormous. But not a single person participating in the Resolve programs has either started or gone back to fighting. And to me, this story is inspiring, and it's also very telling because there are huge differences between the way most peace-building organizations work and what Vijaya did. To start, Vijaya decided to build peace from the grassroots by relying on insiders instead of focusing on elite and leaders based in capital cities. And even more importantly, Vijaya did not come and impose her beliefs, and that way she avoided doing more harm than good. Unlike so many people before her, Vijaya was humble, respectful, and she put ordinary citizens in the driver's seat. Peace builders who work like Vijaya are a small minority in the aid world, but they exist. I've found them within many different organizations in very different countries, and the work they do is incredibly important because unfortunately, there are many people who face the kind of terrible circumstances that Justin and Luca are facing. 1.5 billion people live under the threat of violence in more than 50 conflict zones around the world, in the places that you can see in red on the map. And so peace building is a crucial task for many states and international institutions. And by peace building, I really mean any and all actions that help promote peace before, during, and after a conflict. The thing is, our templates and techniques for approaching war and peace just don't work. Half of all ongoing wars have already started more than 20 years. In just the past 5 years, wars have spawned the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Our newspapers keep running headlines like the ones that you see on the slide. Inhabitants of war-torn countries and onlookers from the outside are fed up with the apparent inability of governments, peacekeepers, and international institutions to end violence. And there has been plenty of discussion about what has gone wrong when we've tried to stop wars in the past. But now it's time to ask what has gone right. And it turns out that elections don't build peace, and democracy itself might not be the golden ticket, at least not in the short term. Contrary to what most politicians preach, building peace doesn't require billions in aid or massive international interventions. Instead, it often involves giving power to ordinary citizens. Ultimately, many successful examples of peace building in the past few years have involved innovative grassroots initiatives led by local people and at times supported by foreigners, like the South African officer that you can see on my slide, often using methods shunned by the international elite. So rather than focusing on failed initiatives and on handshakes between presidents, abstract peace agreements, and negotiations between governments and rebel leaders, the front lines of peace details the concrete, everyday actions that actually make a difference on the ground. So some of these are bizarre, some are creative, some involve age-old traditions, and some are just common sense. My book explains how peace building can actually work so that we can finally improve the lives of billions of people. And I show that to end violence from war and also address violent conflicts at home, we have to fundamentally change the way we view and build peace. And the evidence that I use to make this argument comes from 20 years of work in 12 different conflict zones, the ones that you can see on the map here, including many border areas, where I worked both as an activist and as a researcher. And I also draw on more than 800 in-depth interviews like this one. And so let me tell you the story of Itri, which is quite literally an island of peace in Congo. For the past 20 years, the deadliest conflict since World War II has raged around Itri, and it has caused the deaths of several million people. But Itri itself has avoided mass violence. So the island is stunningly beautiful, as you can see in the photo that I put on my slide and that I took when I was there. But what made the place even more noteworthy and the peace all the more surprising is that the island contains all of the same preconditions for violence that have fueled conflict, generalized fighting in other parts of Congo. Itri has a geostrategic location. It's located right at the border between Congo and Rwanda, two countries that have been at war for the past most of the past 20 years. It also has mineral resources, ethnic tensions, lack of state authority, extreme poverty, local conflict over land and traditional power, and many other features that have caused extensive violence in the neighboring provinces. And what's fascinating about Itri is that the island is peaceful because of the active everyday involvements of all of its citizens, including the poorest and least powerful ones, and including the people you see on my photos. So it's not the army, the state, or the police who manage to control tensions, and it's not foreign peace builders either. It is the members of the community themselves. And they have done that by fostering what they call a culture of peace, by organizing in grassroots associations and local structures that help resolve conflicts, and by drawing on strong beliefs that help deter violence by both insiders and outsiders, such as blood pacts. Blood pacts are traditional promises between two parties who agree never to hurt each other. So the story of each week shows us that local community resources can build peace better than the usual elite agreements and outside interventions. And foreign peace builders can help in this process. So take, for instance, the teams of the Life and Peace Institute in Congo. LPI is a Swedish peace-building organization that is involved in various conflict zones and usually focuses on working at the grassroots. And the LPI Congo team bases its action on in-depth local expertise and rejects universal approaches to peace building. They rely on local employees supervised by a few foreigners, and these foreigners often have extensive pre-existing country knowledge. LPI doesn't implement programs directly. Instead, it works with and through a few hand-picked local organizations. And the main role of these organizations is to support local people on the ground. These local organizations empower ordinary citizens to develop their own analysis of the conflicts they face and to agree on feasible answers, just like they're doing in my photo. And then they implement those solutions. So you see the difference with the usual way to build peace in conflict zones. In the LPI model, it's not foreigners based in capitals and headquarters who conceive, design, and implement peace-building programs. It's not national or international elite either, and it's not the state or the government. Instead, it is the intended beneficiaries and community members themselves, including ordinary people, who conceive, design, and implement peace-building initiatives with the help of LPI and its local partners. So outsiders can help re-establish peace, but the catch is that to really help, international peace builders can't continue acting the way they usually do, because there are countless limitations to the usual conventional way to build peace, which I call Peace Inc., and which relies on government, elites, and foreign peace builders, and usually exclude local citizens and ordinary people. The Peace Inc. usual approach to peace building is based on misleading and detrimental assumptions, such as the ideas that only outsiders have the required skills and expertise to build peace, that only top-down intervention can end armed violence, and that all good things come together. For instance, that elections naturally leads to peace. And I'm happy to elaborate on the problems with these assumptions and our standard approach to peace during the discussion if you're interested. But I want to use the few minutes that I have left to tell you how we can change that. We really need to learn from success stories instead of always focusing on challenges, failures, and problems. So these past few years, I've looked for cases of what I call unlikely peace, meaning places where everything conspires to cause violence, and yet somehow you have peace, like in Italy. And I found places like that all over the world, in Congo, Colombia, Israel and the Palestinian territories, Somalia, etc., like in the two villages where I took these two photos. And the example I like best is the story of Somaliland. So there is a really interesting contrast between, on the one hand, Somalia, which is extremely violent and has some of the highest ranking in some of the world's least desirable categories, most corrupt country, second most failed state, etc. And on the other hand, you have the autonomous borderland region of Somaliland, which went through a devastating war, independence war with Somalia in the late 80s and the 90s, a war that destroyed more than 90% of the towns, And some of these towns still haven't been rebuilt, as you can see in the photo I took in Berbera. But for the past 20 years, Somaliland has experienced little violence, little terrorism, and it now has a well-functioning state, decent public services, as you can see in my photo of the capital Hargeisa, and also some kind of functioning democracy. And there are many reasons, obviously, for this difference, but the key one is that the usual top-down, outsiders-led approach prevailed in the rest of Somalia, while Somaliland benefited from sustained grassroots peace-building initiatives that were led by insiders, by Somalilanders themselves, just like the ones you see on my slide. The experience of Somaliland shows that ordinary people and local leaders can promote peace not only on a small scale, like in HW, but also over a large territory and a quasi-state. And the good news is that we can support these kind of efforts without falling into the same old tired relationships between outsiders and insiders, and without destroying local peace efforts as interveners so often do. Because there are role models that we can learn from. In my research, I found a lot of original, out-of-the-box approaches by foreign peace builders who come from all over the world and who work for very different organizations, including many different United Nations agencies in very different countries. And these model interveners do manage to put local people in the driver's seat and to actually make a difference on the ground. And if you're interested during the discussion, I'm happy to give you a sense of the key practical lessons that we can learn from there. And by way of conclusion, there is one last thing that I want to mention. All of these ideas, all of these lessons from conflict zones can help us address not only conflict in war zones and borderland areas around the world, but also conflict in ostensibly peaceful places like racial, ethnic, religious, and political tensions in the United States or in Europe or in South Korea. And I'm also happy to elaborate on that during the discussion if you're interested. But the overall point is that whether at home or abroad, we solely need more individuals who, like Vijaya and Justin, and like the inhabitants of HW and Somaliland. We solely need more organizations that work like Resolve and the Life and Peace Institute, and more programs that follow the basic principles that I've just told you about. Because it's with individuals and programs like these that we can help the 1.5 billion people who live under the threat of violence in war zones around the world, and that we can also decrease tensions and violence in our own communities. So all of these ideas are not magic wands, but because they take into account deeply rooted causes of conflict, they can definitely be game changers. Thank you so much.
Right. Oh, thank you very much indeed, Professor Otisar. First of all, congratulations, your new book is forthcoming, right? The next year?
Yes, it's coming out in a few months.
Okay, that's good. Right. So I guess they should highlight some kind of ownership or local community, local initiative. Is a very important part of the peacemaking process. So peace building should be homegrown rather than probably done by the external engagement. All right, so we're gonna move on to the second speaker, Professor Heidi Hussein. She is now the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, University of Free State, South Africa. Her topic she bring up today, the feminist border thinking as a means for understanding the gender peace building nexus in Africa. So Professor Hussein, you have 20 minutes for presentation. So now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I am looking forward to the engagement as well. Can Can I just check that you can hear me and that my screen is sharing?
Professor Hansen, could you put the screen full mode?
There we go.
Okay, yeah, great.
Thank you. The topic on feminist border thinking as a means for understanding the gender and peace building nexus in Africa is something that relates to the issue of gender. And we've had the recent celebration of Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And it was the 20th anniversary celebrated in October. And many of you will know that it's a groundbreaking UN resolution that asks that member states ensure that the consideration of gender in peace-building processes is taking place. In relation to Borderlands, I think that it is also then very important to consider gender. What then is the central question? Why does gender matter in building peace and security? Let me start by then say that in terms of borderlands or borders, feminist thinking not only offers an alternative vision of security through the lens of gender, but also presents an inclusive view of global security. Feminist theorizing uses gender as the lens to point out gender inequalities, but then also goes forward to pay attention to the effects of these gendered power relations as they manifest between men and women during and after conflict. So I would like to argue in this presentation that the success of a peace process relies on the security needs from those from below, very much like the speaker before, ordinary people, in other words. And this then opens up possibilities to offer a more inclusive and credible analysis of contemporary peace building from the bottom up. For the purposes of this presentation, I am defining gender not as only meaning women. It is certainly more than acknowledging gender inequality and foregrounding women's needs in peace processes. Considering gender also includes seeing the differential impact of conflict on men and women and the unique knowledge and experiences that both groups bring to the peace table. Gender mainstreaming can provide tangible improvements in women's lives, yes, but its benefits reach beyond improved gender relations. Considering gender in peace building also increases the chances of successful planning, implementation, and institutionalization of a post-conflict order. Feminist concepts and scholarly work is therefore useful to think about borders, and perhaps I should just clarify how I use borders in my presentation. I think of borders and borderlands as real places and spaces, but I also think of them as imaginary and also symbolic spaces, spaces where there are divisions between people, and also in academic disciplines we see these symbolic divides. Certainly, borders and borderlands can also be seen as zones of change, conflict or collaboration, of lawlessness, ungovernability or ambiguity. But in true feminist sense, I also want to think of borderlands as lived, everyday spaces of cross-border cooperation, trade, cultural engagement. All of these mirroring larger processes of social and identity transformation. My aim in this presentation is not to provide a toolkit for doing peace building in a gender-sensitive manner or a manual. What I am trying to do is to provide a provisional conceptual tool for seeing peace differently. I'm hoping that it could help peace builders, practitioners, policymakers at all levels, state and community level, to adopt a wider lens when looking at peace. Feminist border thinking allows for that. The idea is to apply this tool to specific areas of the global south, Africa in particular, which will be the topic of my presentation, or particular conflict zones or borderlands of peace. Now, with this provisional conceptual tool that I call the feminist frontier concept, it consists of 3 pillars that I propose. First of all, metageographies, then masks or mention, and then the 3rd pillar, matter, in other words, the life of objects. And in my presentation, I'm going to talk to each one of them, and then in the conclusion, briefly talk about how I see it come together. So starting then with pillar 1, metageographies. For me, this means it relates to the ideological dimension of a geographical space. There are two meanings here. On the one hand, it is this construction of a singular, totalizing spatial framework, where the term refers to an ideological mental space construction where certain dominant peace, security, and political economy discourses and practices are entrenched in relation to particular spaces such as Africa, where there's a deep sense of mental colonization. A second definition or meaning of the term metageography relates to the idea that it is a space where human society is ordered in a rather violent way and compartmentalized as different, as the other, and therefore inferior. Let me give you some very familiar stereotypes of the space called Africa. We're all familiar with the problematic framing of Africa as a single country. We're familiar with the framing of Africa as a hopeless dark continent. Also, the flip side of that is the notion of the Africa rising, which is the Afro over-optimistic depiction of the state of affairs on the continent. The notion that Africa is history, but only in relation to Europe, that Africa exists on the margins of world politics, that Africa is deviant and that you can only use case studies from Africa to apply Western theory. Therefore, very little to say about Africa from a theoretical point of view. The other stereotype that we often confronted with is the idea that Africa is only about the local and not about the global. In scholarship and policy-making circles, there's often an emphasis on Africa's empirical richness and case study potential, and as a site where theories can be tested. But this often reinforces the marginalized position of the continent, of this geographical space. So it is worth remembering then that gender and peace-building discourses in relation to these colonized spaces are never without geography nor geographically innocent. Although there has been attempts to focus on everyday peace building with a concern for the local hybrids, post-liberal peace building, and so forth, many critics have not succeeded in dislodging the liberal peace as the central subject of inquiry. Even critical feminist scholars have struggled to get away from the coloniality because often they disregard the presence of African feminist perspectives on peace and security. So what then is the solution, if I may call it a solution or an alternative way of conceptualizing it? First of all, I think we need to be aware of the mental space that we're working with, that metageography that sees Africa as colonized and inferior in the eyes of the West. And then from there, the next step would be to make a connection between this coloniality of the geographical space and the liberal peace-building practices that are all part of a global coloniality that is at once racialized, patriarchal, gendered, and so forth. And then lastly, I think that to get it to the practical side, we have to listen to the voices on the margins, where the oppression is felt. Moving on then to the second pillar, masks and mention. I want to move away from the abstract construction of a metageography or an ideological space and then look more practically at the overlapping and intersecting identities and agencies and subjectivities of the people who play a role in this peace-building exercise. Relevant here is the fact that we need to think about the whole spectrum of agencies of both locals and international actors. We sometimes forget that peace builders also come with a whole range of intersected identities. For this purpose, I believe that we must unmask, and that is why the pillar is called masks, these stereotypes that lie behind or beneath this notion of the human being or the mensch. Mensch or Menschen, the plural, is a Yiddish term that refers to the average human being, the average person. But this term often presents us with a rather neutral concept, which masks the idea that some of the groups may not be included. This seemingly neutral concept belies the reality of gendered power dynamics among peace builders on the ground, particularly in their engagement with the locals. And therefore, we also need to consider the very familiar but often very difficult to do away with stereotypes related to gender, thinking and seeing men only as protectors or perpetrators of violence and women only as helpless, peaceful mothers or victims. What then in this case, related to this pillar, would be the solution or the alternative? I argue that it's very important to understand how agency is constructed and assigned, and how certain states and organizations that are powerful can assign agency to certain groups and deny agency from others. Agency is therefore always relationally situated, structurally embedded, and historically shaped. And as I've mentioned before, we have to consider the complex intersected subjectivities of all role players related to race, gender, ethnicity, age, urban, rural, sexuality, and many more. And then lastly, I argue then that if we see these different groups differently, we will be able to do peace building differently. And let me give a practical example here. The case of Sierra Leone comes to mind in terms of DDR. It is often difficult to target and to ensure that the money goes to the right group. In Sierra Leone, there were very many bushwives, and traditionally bushwives are not considered to be combatants. There's a traditional association of men being combatants, and therefore they were excluded from the benefits during the post-conflict phase to benefit from the distribution of prosthetic limbs and others. My argument is, if you understand that identity is complex and intersected, it will help you in your budgeting process as peace builders to target the right group and to ensure that the money goes to those most marginalized and most in need of the funding. In other words, we must avoid a situation where you take marginalized groups and you make them compete against one another so that they then remain marginalized in the process. And this is certainly not what we would like to see happen. Lastly then, the third pillar relates to objects. So while I've talked about human subjectivity, I now turn to the agency of things. I'm arguing that we also need to consider that the agency of humans and their multiple identities could be curtailed or constrained, and hopefully one day be given certain opportunities by looking at the agency of things. By this, I'm not saying that it has to be an anti-human project, but I do believe that the decentering of the human subject needs to take place so that we can place the humans in as part and not at the center of a post-anthropocentric future. For this purpose then, I look at two types of materialities. The first one is more in a negative sense, the materiality of security objects and the power that they exert over people. Practical example here, in the DRC, for instance, it's resource rich. We often have private security companies who have to protect mining companies. They erect high barriers and walls and barbed wire. And in the end, they alienate or they place a distance between themselves and the people that they actually need to protect. So in this way, the walls and the wire fences and the bright lights and the curfews actually become sources of governance and control, and in a very negative sense, quite violent. So as peace builders, we need to be aware to what extent objects can actually exert power in a negative way. The flip side of that is another type of materiality where we have to turn to the everyday, peace building and security, where we have to concentrate on the fact that peace building, as well as war and conflicts, is always bodily experienced, and it's sensed experience, something that you can touch and feel and smell. This then takes us to the need for a more sustainable approach to focus on women's and men's everyday lives as they are affected by the complex relationship between gendered capitalist and militarist processes and how men and women negotiate their lives through both. We must pay attention to peacekeeping economies in these borderlands and post-conflict economic recovery, because the material aspects tell us a lot about the everyday life after conflict. The types of work that locals do in relation to peacekeepers, for instance, domestic, sex, or private security work. So this kind of feminist border thinking makes us think about the political economy of peace interventions in relation to those people targeted by the intervention, as well as the material effects of the intervention itself. Chair, in conclusion then, let me sum up and say that I've tried in this presentation to focus on three kinds of agency. The one where we talk about the colonized spaces of geography and to what extent that creates a sense of deprivation and lack of agency for certain geographical spaces. I've talked about the need for a complex, overlapping and intersected understanding of people's agencies and subjectivities, and also placing those subjectivities in relation to objects and matter. How then could this theoretical tool be applied to a real life situation? What I can say as a provisional statement is to say that this kind of agency should not be seen as non-linear or non-linear or non-directional. It is not something that is linear, given to locals by peace builders. It is something that is a complex process that is relationally constructed. In other words, it is important, using this tool and the three pillars, to rethink the logic of relations. I believe that in this process, we can say that the policymakers and practitioners will benefit because a wider lens can help them to make more inclusive and equitable decisions. And if you write your policy, being aware of all these various aspects, the policy can also then be more just and more inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Hudson. Wow, it's kind of the concentrate on the discursive and material dynamics of peace building in Borderlands or the post-colony, with a particular reference to the agenda, mainstreaming. So thank you very much indeed. It's quite informative, and I learned a lot. So probably I can recap, because it's my beyond my knowledge, beyond my ability. So but I try to recap. Probably the gender mainstreaming or feminist border thinking is kind of intersubjective process, like the social construction between probably the structure or agent, but diversity of the agents, including gender, including the other marginalized people, local people. So I think it's going to be fantastic, like the theorization to conclude. I mean, include the macro and micro, like the mid-range theory. So thank you again. Right. So we're going to move on the next speaker. I will invite the Professor Erica Weinthal. She's a professor of the environmental and public policy at the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University in U.S. So she will present water, borders, and peace building. So Professor Weinthal, you have 20 minutes presentation. So you have floor now.
Okay. I presume you can see my screen and hear me fine? Okay, perfect. So again, I just also want to thank the organizers for this session. It has been a wonderful session, and I love how all the presentations come together. I will be speaking about water and borders and the relationship to peace building. And I will just preface with, water more than any other resource doesn't respect political borders. And in many ways, part of this workshop or conference session is about, political borders, sovereignty, the nation state, and water resources in no way respect the borders of the nation state. And so in my presentation today, I'll actually be showing lots of maps because to really understand the way water meanders and how it affects national security, economic security, livelihoods, food security, gender, one needs to understand the different ways in which water interacts with people. So I'm just going to start with a few comments on water to give a sense of when we talk about water and its properties, how water has different meanings and has different political understandings. In many instances, water is a scarce resource. And in the conflict field, we often talk about water scarcity as the main cause of conflict. But one should also understand that scarcity is something that is often created by humans, that in some instances it may be naturally occurring depending on the distribution of water resources within a country, or even temporarily. There are certain parts of the world where you have intense rainfall during certain seasons, and then you have no rainfall during other seasons. So there's this high variability in its availability, but also through the way we use water, we can also create scarcity. And so I will talk a bit about anthropogenic forms of water scarcity. Water, unlike other natural resources, is something that there is no substitute. So when we look at energy resources, we can always talk about substitutes. We can talk about substituting coal for natural gas. We can talk about nuclear, hydro. When it comes to water, there is no substitute. We need it for our health, for our livelihoods. And without water, we see a rise in disease, economies collapsing. Water also plays an incredibly important role within countries, culturally, religiously. In the Middle East, water has always had a spiritual component where I spend a lot of my time. And one of the issues when we talk about borders today that I'm going to emphasize is that it's a shared resource. And it's a shared resource between countries and within countries and among communities. And rivers, what's so unusual about rivers is that they can flow successively between countries or between communities, or they can be contiguous where they form a border. So they take many different forms. This happens to be a picture of the Jordan River. So we often think of the Jordan River as this mighty river, but in many instances, it's a very small river. There are many, many transboundary rivers globally, over about 276, spread across the globe, most of which are in Europe, which we often forget how many transboundary rivers are in Europe, but also in Africa and Asia. If you just look at a map and look at river basins, you will see the visual of how they don't comport with political borders. And I will hone on this a little bit more as I go through the presentation. One of the things I want to underscore up front about the importance of water, especially when we go down to the local level and the communities that are most dependent upon water, which has implications for human security, is the extent of water poverty across the world. We're talking about over 780 million people who are still without access to improved sources of drinking water, about 2.5 billion who lack improved sanitation. These numbers have become more pronounced during the pandemic because one of the most important issues for coping during the pandemic is having access to clean water to be able to wash hands. So why look at water when we talk about borderlands? One of the things about water is there's this natural hydrological interdependence that demands cooperation. Countries share water resources, And to prevent pollution, to prevent overutilization, countries need to cooperate, communities need to cooperate. And most of the most contested areas in the world where you see political conflict also have some of the most contested water basins. But what has been so unusual, if you look at the Indus Basin in South Asia, there has been a treaty between India and Pakistan for over half a century, where they have shared their the tributaries of the Indus, between 3 to Pakistan, 3 to India. And even when there has been violent conflict, they have continued to adhere to the treaty. So water in many ways is a resource that provides opportunities across borders in borderlands for cooperation. And I'll talk more about the Jordan River rivers, but we also see numerous instances of cooperation in the region. Just to give a sense, since we've had a lot of speakers speaking about Africa today, how many international river basins are in Africa? And I'm using slides from a number of my colleagues who work on water and peace building, so just to acknowledge different organizations that are also working in the space of environmental peace building, which I will talk a bit more about too. But just to give a sense, the Congo River Basin crosses many states. The Nile River Basin has 11 riparians that share the Nile. And with the inclusion of South Sudan, that brought it up to 11, but we're also seeing river basins change over time. So this is something about water. There is also a form of fluidity that goes with studying river basins, and that we see changes in river basins as states change too, also as uses change. So the Nile Basin in many ways is a fascinating basin to be looking at right now, because there has been a treaty between Sudan and Egypt since 1959 on the distribution of the waters of the Nile, of which about 80% went to Egypt. And in recent years, Ethiopia has begun to build a dam upstream, which has changed the dynamics in the Nile Basin, causing the countries to have to come together to renegotiate. And this has been a very fraught process, but it is an ongoing process through different outside actors, through the Nile Basin Initiative, through the African Union, trying to find a new solution for the sharing of the Nile Basin. And one of the things we know from looking at international water is that often uses change over time. Most frequently, downstream users begin to use water first for agriculture, and that has been the case in the Nile Delta. But over time, upstream states then want to develop water for hydro purposes, for hydroelectricity. And this requires, this changes the dynamic in water basins. So there is this, one should never look at a water basin in a very fixed manner, because as rivers flow, uses also change, interests change, power dynamics change in a water basin. I have spent the last few years, many years, over a decade, I guess, working in partnership with a number of organizations under the umbrella of UN Environment, with colleagues at a number of universities, trying to look at the relationship between environmental resources and natural resources and conflict and peace building, and trying to conceptualize, what are the risks to conflict if one does not think about the environment and natural resources, and what are the opportunities from including natural resources in a peace process. And as we heard about the Congo had many different instances of natural resources being linked to the conflict, but there's been many opportunities for natural resources to be leveraged for building peace, especially in the water sector. And there are case studies from the Kivus of wonderful examples of NGOs. I'm going to start on the left side of the spectrum and over the top move to the right side, but really using water to understand how, if water is not considered in this conflict spectrum, you can have increasing tension. It can be utilized as a weapon of war, but there's also these opportunities for peace building, is an entry point for dialogue, providing economic incentives for peacemaking. So I'm going to start with some of my early work in Central Asia, in the RLC Basin, that goes back now several decades to the early 1990s, where I was studying how the states in Central Asia came together to create water sharing arrangements for the management of the RLC Basin. And here I just want to emphasize the way in which water was thought to be a source of tension and the opportunities that water offered for preventative diplomacy, for promoting dialogue and peacemaking, and for promoting regional cooperation. One of the things I want to highlight too is often I'm talking about transboundary, but if institutions and governance mechanisms don't scale to the local level, there's often a disconnect between what water lawyers, international negotiators are doing globally and from what is happening on the ground at the level of farms and those that are dependent on water for the agricultural sector. So Central Asia, like the Nile Basin, had a change and shift in riparians. It went from a basin of one, it was the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union collapsed, to 5 new riparians: Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And there are 2 main rivers, the Sirdarya and the Amudarya, that flow, each of them at least through 3 states, to the RLC Basin. And under the Soviet Union, the water system was managed entirely from Moscow, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a change in political borders, which also changed the dynamics, the shape of the water system. It went from being a domestic water system to an international water system. So you lost a hegemon that could, in many ways, determine how to use water, which was largely for the growing of cotton monoculture during the Soviet Union, to one where every state had its own individual interests and the power dynamics changed. This was an incredibly important case because you can see this was once a very vibrant fishing community, and through practices during the Soviet Union, scarcity was created and an environmental calamity was created that over a period from 1960 to 1990, the RLC desiccated, sea level fell, the surface level was reduced, salinity increased. And so this was, one of these massive environmental disasters that caught the international attention. And just to give a sense of, from NASA, what the RLC, the drying up of the RLC looks like from outer space, and how you can see how water boundaries have shifted. So again, I like to visualize how the relationship between water, its riparians, and the interests. And so in a water, an international river, we're often talking about upstream, midstream, downstream, and how they have different interests. So upstream states are often more interested in developing hydropower, where downstream states often want to use water for agriculture. In the absence of a hegemon from Moscow, these interests solidified, where they shifted from an agricultural irrigation regime to a hydropower regime. And just to give an example of how this played out, if you just look at the Amudarya River, there were once water and energy were traded, so there was this natural interdependence between them. Uzbekistan over time wanted to cut off natural gas to Tajikistan and request payment after the states became independent, so they all began to have their individual interests. And Tajikistan wanted to build a dam so it could then develop its hydropower and also potentially sell it to Afghanistan. And so you're seeing changing interests, and in the absence of cooperation, you see states diverging. And again, in these border areas where you have a hydrological interdependence, one requires cooperation. And so you had lots of international activity that I discuss in this book about how to foster cooperation and shared interests among the states. And why cooperation is so important increasingly is also, we're living in a world in which we're experiencing a climate crisis. The climate is changing, and the rivers in Central Asia are fed by glaciers. And as you have more glacial melt, this is also going to affect the water sharing regime. So you need adaptive governance. You need adaptive mechanisms of cooperation. Also, Afghanistan is a riparian, and as Afghanistan continues with its rebuilding process, it's going to also have more demands on the water resources. So you need to expand treaties. So you have to have treaties that are flexible and adaptive. So just turning to one other area, which is a project that I was involved with UN Environment and Environmental Law Institute and other organizations, which was on natural resource management and post-conflict peace building. And I worked on the volume on water, trying to understand this relationship between water and conflict and peace building. If you look at the 55 countries that were affected by major conflicts during or since 1990, 51 share at least one basin. So there is this opportunity for cooperation when we look at water resources. We looked at case studies from all over the world. We had different authors write cases. So again, generating lessons learned, both at the transboundary level, but at the local level of NGOs that were at the forefront of focusing on the informal sector and leveraging, private water suppliers into peace building efforts. One of the reasons why looking at water is so important in peace building efforts is that water is often targeted during war. And there is a long history of targeting water as a weapon of war. In World War II, Allied bombings damaged Germany's water treatment facilities. The Soviets damaged Afghanistan's irrigation system. The hydroelectric facility in Monrovia was destroyed. But also water is, and rivers are, there are attempts to control and divert rivers to punish communities, to flood cities, to destroy livelihoods, dating back to a plan with Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli to divert the Arno River. And then in 1991, Saddam Hussein draining the Mesopotamian marshlands, which have yet to fully recover. So restoring water at war's end is incredibly important for human security within countries. It can generate peace dividends at the national level to restore trust and confidence in the peace building process. And one of the lessons learned from all of this work has been the importance of governance, and that in the absence of governance, many of these initiatives will often fail. And so we're seeing a lot of effort at addressing water in post-conflict constitutions and peace processes, which is something very new. If you look at treaties over time, you would not have seen this in the early 20th century, but at late 20th century, we were seeing natural resources being a focus of peace building efforts. And so moving to this other side of the spectrum of what does it mean for opportunities for post-conflict peace building or peace building in general. Yugoslavia, we have a wonderful case from the Sava River Basin where, one of the first efforts after the collapse of Yugoslavia was to find ways to come together to cooperate over the Sava River Basin. These efforts served as a catalyst for fostering dialogue, capitalizing on shared interests, and has led to other efforts in the Balkans to develop opportunities for cooperation. The Jordan River, a shared river between multiple riparians, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, Palestine. But for many decades, Israeli and Jordanian water managers would meet along the border of the Jordan River informally in what was known as the Israel-Jordan picnic table talks. So they would find ways outside of the limelight to discuss how to manage the water, their shared water resources. So it was a lifeline during periods of intense conflict. When Israel and Jordan negotiated their peace treaty in 1994, water was central and foundational to that treaty. And one of the reasons was that you already had informal talks taking place between Israelis and Jordanians. And so often these informal conversations that are taking place outside of political processes can provide the mechanism then to negotiate in a formal governance mechanism. And so in this treaty, we see the establishment of a joint water committee. We see different allocations of water between Israel and Jordan. You know, we've heard a lot about the different ways in which civil society can play a role, different communities in building peace across borders. There are numerous initiatives, efforts that have been taking place for many years in the Middle East. Two that I think are just wonderful forms of NGO cooperation have been, one is Barn Owls Know No Borders, so bringing together Jordanians, Israelis, Palestinians to work together on nature conservation, biodiversity protection. And then there's an organization, Eco-Peace Middle East, also previously known as Friends of the Earth Middle East, that has really focused on the restoration of the Lower Jordan, bringing together what are essentially neighbors, different communities, mayors, children, educators, to work together on environmental efforts to share, to use water as a way to build cooperation. And then peace parks is another area that is where we see different forms of cooperation. One of the most famous was between Ecuador and Peru, but we're seeing this increasingly where there have been water bodies. The Balkans, there's a proposed Balkans peace park there that has also generated jobs. It plays a role in restoring livelihoods for communities in water resource management. Eco-Peace Middle East has been working on one for the Jordan River, a Jordan River Peace Park. And then other forms of potential cooperation in the Middle East, again, where borders, across borders, has been, like the Aral Sea, the Dead Sea has been drying up and desiccating. And so there's been plans, discussions to think about a way to build a conveyance carrier from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea to try to restore the Dead Sea, but also to provide water for Amman, which is has limited water resources. And so these are other initiatives taking place in the Middle East. And so with this presentation today, I've tried to give you a sense of a wide array of endeavors that are taking place that link natural resources to conflict and peace building. And I want to conclude by just noting what really matters across all of these efforts is a focus on governance, because without governance at all levels of scale, it will be very difficult to ensure that water access to waters can be provided to meet basic human needs for livelihoods, food security, but also for addressing climate change impacts, which will become increasingly important in all of our efforts when we're thinking about water and natural resources. And then my last slide, if anyone is interested, a lot of this work is being done through the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And there's a website, it's a knowledge platform where we share lots of information and a newsletter about all these different endeavors, efforts. We've had our first conference 2 years ago, and we'll have another one in 2022. And with that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Wintel. I am very much enlightened by your presentation, especially the water. Water should be regarded as the independent variable, right, affecting all the aspects of peace building process. So fair resources and water poverty and international and water basin is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much indeed once again. But you just missed the one. You covered everything, every single case, right, of the conflicts and tension regarding the international water basin. But maybe you're missing the Mekong River, right?
It's in the document that I sent you. Okay. Right. But yes, the Mekong is another important river basin that has had a mechanism for cooperation for many decades.
Okay. One more thing. The Professor Wintel. She already the last slide explained a little bit. She is the founding member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and served as vice president back in 2017, right? So yeah, so I just share the record with all of us. All right, so the last, but nonetheless, so sorry to keep you waiting, Professor Richmond. So the Professor Richmond in Manchester University in UK. So he will present the peace formation from below, emancipation versus counter peace. So the Professor Richmond, you have the floor. So maybe you can use like 20 minutes.
Sure. Well, I'll be relatively brief actually, but thank you for the invitation and organising this, and really interesting to hear my colleagues' previous presentations too. I would like to start on the premise that in a way we've been invited here to speak today about localized and everyday forms of peace building, because liberal and nationalist forms, which themselves are premised upon centralized authority and bordering, are on the brink of failure. So there is some sort of sense that by engaging with subaltern claims for political rights and order, whether they range from gender or the ability to organize independently and autonomously at the civil level, or to transgress borders, or to make use of shared resources in the commons, or to re-establish the commons. These are, if you like, the sorts of claims that we would get from the everyday locality of peacemaking, but they're not represented at the international or state level with the same direction and the same directness. So if we see existing borders as a representation of failed state authority or failed imperial authority, as well as an indication of breaks on social cooperation and collaboration and on trade, then the nexus between centralized authority in the modern state and borders is a nexus which causes violence and war, or has caused violence and war, or is prone to those things and is fragile. So there is a certain sense in the literature that has engaged with the everyday locality, local ownership, with a range of non-official, non-state type rights, claims, subaltern forms of political order, that there is something which has been missed by liberal peace building, by state building, and by many of the regimes of order production that have come to us from the Enlightenment through Hobbes and onwards to the liberal peace framework. So I'd like to try and dig a little bit more into this. I think it's fairly clear when you listen to the presentations previously in this panel, but also when you look at the enormous amount of data that has been amassed now on localized engagements with peace, that the possibility, the potential for transgression of borders is often viewed as necessary for peacemaking. So cross-border activity, whether it's trade or conflict resolution or transformation, social events, resource sharing, establishing new commons and so on and so forth, are often at the forefront of political claims that are being ignored from the subaltern and which are not included in peace processes and which are not included in peace building, which have not been included in the formulation of the modern state. So historically, that suggests to us that at least until recently, it's been pretty easy to ignore everyday locality, the subaltern, issues of gender, issues of sustainable resource use, sustainability, conflict resolution, social mobilization activism, as we've heard so far, in peace processes, while at the same time claiming that they are peace processes. In other words, claiming that one can establish a legitimate political order through this process, even though there have been all of these exclusions. And I would say that, historically and in recent times, that's a product of the fact that the political order has been a top-down political order, which was first primarily established to balance geopolitics, then established to deal with major industrialized wars, then began to engage with the expanded frameworks of rights that came to us in the Cold War through the ideological challenge, and also through the decolonial or post-colonial attack on this kind of hangover imperial system that we had through until the 1960s. And then later with the connection of human rights and foreign policy being firmly embedded in state practice, and then the connection with development and so on. So we have this further extension of rights, which becomes built into liberal peace building by the late 20th century and into the early 21st century. And what we have then sort of occurring is a sort of house of cards, where we have created a platform upon which rights claims can be extended from a variety of different perspectives, which have led us to thinking about sustainability, equality in numerous different ways, and has pulled us back away from centralized authority, whether it's in a hegemonic order or in a kind of Leviathan situation where a state is dominated by centralized power, to thinking about local ownership, decentralization, equality, and all of this points to the formalization of the transgression of borders, the weakening of borders in modern international order. And that was pretty much the argumentation that we were getting from the 1990s onwards and was being built into international architecture, if you like. Short, sharp shock recently has pulled us away from that. Anyway, I'd like to consider what that means for peace processes. So we're talking about the inversion of a peace process, where it's no longer driven by a meeting of leviathans or the intervention of hegemons or imperial powers, or even a kind of domesticated version of those in the modern UN system or the modern development system, the donor system, and so on. But it's one in which we have to start to see the peace process being formed from the ground up. And that's a kind of tautology in a way. It's very difficult because you have to think about the power relations that lead to conflict, that form the borders and that centralized authority over time. And then you have to put those into the context of subaltern agency. We've heard a challenge to extractive agency. We've heard a challenge to patriarchy. We've heard a challenge to the idea that externalized political authority can set the scripts for peace in this panel so far. And what I'm suggesting is that what we're creating is a situation where the weakest in a conflict or a conflict-affected society are expected to have the most incisive views about the reconstitution of political order through a peace process, and also the leverage through which to establish a new political order. So I've been calling this peace formation, and this is the idea that rather than forming the state through a peace process, or what we later came to know as peace building and state building, through the balancing of powers and the establishment of a globalized technology of politics, that's the liberal, democratic, capitalist trading order that was liberal peace building, we're actually now going back to these various subaltern scripts, which are fundamentally challenging the ways in which we have organized peace. So peace in terms of a bounded peace with a variety of centralized authorities, which are all devolved from the state. Peace in terms of free movement of capital and the kind of extractive practices that have emerged from that. Peace which has emerged from basic human rights rather than expanded notions of rights and so on. So all of these scripts which we're expecting to be used to form modern political order after war are themselves externalized, and they are based on kind of universalized or blueprint type modeling of what political claims would be made against a post-conflict state and how authority can be re-established. When we go to this massive data bank that's been built up perhaps in the last 20 years about localized political claims, we don't see much resemblance. Rights aren't basic. Democracy, as we imagine it, is probably less representative than we tend to be thinking about. Capitalism is often a problem rather than a solution. Geopolitics have not been pushed back by these treaties and settlements, by peacekeeping and peace building in that period. And so we've ended up in a situation where there are all of these frozen conflicts, where peace has been built from an external perspective, and it's anchored to a basic notion of balance, basic notions of rights, very limited forms of democracy, and more or less sustained and supported by external security guarantees and some flows of capital, often which are grey forms of capital, which are predatory. And none of this really matches up to the sorts of values and systems and standards that you would see in, for example, the UN's recent Sustaining Peace Agenda. Okay, so we have a mismatch here between externalized top-down history of peacemaking as it turned into peace building and state building, and the rather more radical claims, despite the fact that we see politics all the way down to the local, that would emerge from engaging with these sorts of subaltern rights. Now, they are filtering into the discourse, but they're very co-opted. If you think about the way in which human security has been deployed over the last 20 years or more in international praxis, at every twist and turn, human security as a concept, which was supposed to put the subaltern in the foreground in security frameworks, in situations of insecurity, of which there are so many and have been, also in peace building frameworks, also in development frameworks. But at every point along the journey of human security, until it no longer was really being used in policy, in politics and in policy making, multilaterally at least, the impetus was to force the human away from security and to push the security back to the geopolitical. So all of these concepts that we've been using have become compromised by the fact that they are based on geopolitics, on the kind of rescuing or restitution of a collapsed colonial order through the modern state, which itself depends on centralized authority and bordering. Now, I would sort of try to make the argument that at least in peace processes where there has been substantial engagement with civil society, where there has been some attempt to read the political agendas that would be needed for a peace process to be viable beyond geopolitics, we get a much more radical political agenda than that. So in that context, where we talk about everyday peace building, I don't think we're just talking about the establishment of resilient practices or tiny little oases of, let's say, cooperative and collaborative practice. Actually, what we're talking about is something which has also been resonant historically. We're talking about the substantial reform of political order in order to engage with subaltern claims. Those subaltern claims, I think, in peace processes where you can read them and engage with them, are suggestive of questions like, or questions relating to historical injustice not being resolved in peace processes. The continuation of distributive injustice, that is inequality, both locally and globally, which are being not re-established, but maintained in peace processes, which follow certain models of development, New York, Washington consensus style. But there's more to it also than that. They are suggesting local forms of peace processes, peace formation are suggesting that Weberian notions of state authority simply have failed, that there are multiple authorities. Many of these authorities involve transgressions of boundaries and bordering, whether they're ceasefire lines, informal borders, formal borders, stratifications of class, identity, gender, and so on. So, although there have been a lot of arguments about the fact that local agency and local peace processes may be pre-political, may not have much politics going on, I think they're actually astoundingly political. They do engage with problems of state reform. They evolve clever tactics, which are often quite marginal and hidden and have to be heavily disguised and are long-term because they're weak and powerful. These are weapons of the weak, not weapons of the powerful. They are often embedded in more sustainable practices when it comes to political economy. They carry intergenerational social memories and dynamics. They remember the disruptions, they carry the pain of war and all the rest of it, but they also are embedded in long-standing cultural institutions. That's not to say that they are, and I can give lots of examples of these things, but I don't have time, but that's not to say that they are the solution to modern peace and war, because war, conflict and violence has shifted from, states, imperial, colonial, decolonial, ethnic, industrialized practices, their scales are far greater than these social sorts of institutions and practices that we're bringing forward here. So it's really unfair to put those kinds of social forms of peace formation, which are aiming to transform the state and the international system, and to get rid of many of those things that we actually use in peace processes to make peace. This is the paradox. But they're working in the very long term, in the very marginal corners. Now, I think for modern technology of peacemaking, that's not good enough. What we have is an international practice which is using failed and flawed machinery, reiterating the very inequalities and balances that cause conflict. And then on the other hand, we have these hidden social techniques and practices, which are, let's say, only able to work in the shadows and in the very long term when we're talking about actually very pressing issues, okay? Some of which involve nuclear annihilation, right? So what do we do about this? This is where intervention has come in. It's highly problematic, and we in the peace and conflict studies communities, many people started working on local peace agencies and became interested in these things because we wanted to get away from intervention. But when we look at in simple terms, the balance between the weight of power in the state system and the global economy, which is performing a lot of functions, using a lot of tactics and strategies to maintain their powers, which are also causing these conflicts, which have great cost at those social levels. When you look at the balance between that agency and the kind of social and local agency that we see that have those capacities and are fulfilling those scripts, you can see an enormous imbalance. So we have to set ourselves to thinking about how we make this localized peace agency, peace formation processes, how we push it forward in a way which doesn't risk its integrity into a situation where it is capable of scripting reform. So that means that we can't just have descriptive methodologies for engaging with localized peace practices, because those descriptive methodologies will comply with counterinsurgency type stabilization missions, with the continuing functioning of a capitalist economy, which is predatory in areas of weak governance and unsustainability, therefore, and with ways in which politics are conducted according to stratifications which are not conducive to peace in those contexts. So they become complicit in that. What we need to think about is how we can enable those processes. And I think liberal peace building, peacekeeping, all of those UN practices, development aid, in a way, these were early and primitive attempts to more sensitively, increasingly sensitively, foreground those kinds of positive possibilities over the kind of failed power structures that actually maintained the Leviathan and a 16th or 17th century international system, which has no response to modern conflict. I'll just sort of wrap up here, I think, just to say that this is a modern and recent development. You know, it's not an innovative reflex to go to the local and to realize that there are scripts there. There is the possibility of identifying new forms of politics, new ways of constituting order, expanding rights and so on by understanding the claims of the victims and the most marginalized against the failings of the modern state, the international system, the global economy, and so on and so forth. None of that is particularly new. And I think if we go all the way back to the 17th century, we can see that there have been layers of such subaltern responses to a whole variety of global and local conflict issues of their day, whether it's been imperialism and colonialism, slavery, the narrow franchise or no franchise, the lack of democracy, the inability to conceptualize rights in international law, disarmament, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these practices ultimately came from subaltern scripts. And it was the moment, often several centuries later, when those subaltern scripts were picked up by power, they would pass into policy. So that would be documentation, scripts, into policy practice, and then into law. And that's when they gained leverage and power. At that moment, they were already inadequate. So what we have emerging from multiple subaltern scripts over time, which are constantly identifying new conflict issues, identifying new powers that produce, or clashes of powers that produce conflict, new inequalities, new injustices, new unsustainabilities, is an attempt to imagine how one would treat those in one's context. And then there is later on, after a systemic crisis, an attempt to scale that up into a bigger systemic framework. Now that's left us with the state system today, the liberal international multilateral order, the donor system, the NGO system. And what we're sort of trying to work out now with this, I think this new wave of research on locality and peace building actually is what the next layer will be, which will respond to the frozen conflicts of today, the conflicts where we failed to address many of those issues from the 1960s onwards, and also the new and emerging types of conflicts, environmental conflicts, urban conflicts, and so on, and so forth. So this is not a phenomenon which we shouldn't be unfamiliar with. Most of these sorts of issues have been addressed in the past, but there's been a huge time lag. The scripts were often, the scripts for subaltern revision of the system were often issued 300 years or 200 years or 100 years before they became practice and law in international institutional order. So another thing that we need to consider, along with this problem of intervention, is how we shrink that gap. So we need to read the scripts, we need to translate them into practice, we need to shrink the time gap between the reading and the translation, and we need to find the power in order to foreground those sorts of scripts. Now, if we can't do those things, I think there is a risk that the liberal peace building order and what's been built on top of it will collapse. I mean, it's more or less moribund at the moment. It's not really been used anywhere. There are no real new liberal peace building missions in process. This is partly because the kinds of claims that are being made against liberal peace building from the subaltern, if you like, cannot be realized through that system. So we need a more substantial engagement, and more substantial reform at the international level is also called for in parallel. I think I can leave it there, if that's okay.
Thank you. Wow, it's terrific. It is like the lecture rather than presentation, so I learned a lot. So you describe I think they highlight the importance of localities, right? And then bring the locality back into our domain discussion. I mean, against like the neoliberal or the capitalism, right? So, and also you mentioned weapons of the weak. I mean, James Scott. So it is another, I think, the important part of your argument. And so certain responses to the changing like order, but it's like the top down from the liberal international order. All right. So actually, we finished the 4 presentations. They're all wonderful. I'm very happy to listen to your presentation all. So do we have, I think, around 20 minutes for discussion. Actually, you can check now the chatting box. There are some questions. So I will read some questions, especially 2 questions directed to Erica. So first question is how can cross-border development initiatives be made sustainable without disrupting nature as well as people-to-people contact? So this question is raised by the Karpana Jha from Nepal. This question direct to the Erica. And the second one, natural disasters considered a major issue for environment and peace. From the Fabez Mahmood in Bangladesh. This question also directed to the Erica. And then the common question to all of you, I will read one by one. The first question, what are ways to communicate and come to a mutual understanding about what peace may mean for Borderlands? So this question raised by the Yuli Kim from South Korea. And the second question, in which ways does the development of borderlands, and their appropriation by different groups transform conceptions of geopolitical territories? raised by Chris Romanos from Netherlands. And the next one, how can there be development and peace in a capitalist world? I think this question could be answered by Professor Richmond, hopefully. So this question is raised by the Akim Pelu, Olutayo from the Nigeria. And another question is how generalizable the discussion to other regions and the borderlands of the world. So the Agnes do from the Switzerland. All right, so I think the original, we have common question, 4 different common questions to everyone, and then the 2 questions to specifically Erica. So I think Erica, you can go first to give answer to 2 questions, and then you can pick up some questions from our common questions.
How about I'll start with just the 2 questions so I don't take up too much time.
Okay.
Thank you for those questions. And I think, it's really important for any of the work we do in this space to make sure that we understand that peace building is also about protecting ecosystems and the well-being of the environment in which. And one of, what has been apparently clear when looking at international cooperation and attempts to build political peace cooperation, you can often find ways to destroy the environment in that process. And so, I've been studying the RLC for decades, and even though, negotiators, mediators, aid agencies, humanitarians have all been involved in trying to find ways to develop mechanisms for cooperation at the interstate level, at the community level with water user associations, the RLC has continued to desiccate and dry up. So there has never been an attempt, even though it's been under the umbrella of working to save the RLC, to actually save the conflict has been largely prevented. There's been some, tension, escalation without real violence, but you haven't seen what was once feared as real violent conflict. And part of the problem with this is if you just focus on the formal governance structures, you miss what I think a lot of our panelists have been talking about, what happens at the local level and the importance of livelihoods, human security. And in Central Asia, this would have required a different approach that took into account the political economy of cotton monoculture and how that created a form of social control, and really rethinking efforts to work on diversifying the agricultural sector and working with communities to see what would have been most beneficial when it came to water use and land issues for livelihoods. And part of this too is thinking cross-sectorally about the relationship between water and land and livelihoods. Also, gender when it comes to women in the household in many of these places. So it requires a scaling down to ensure that there is a more comprehensive approach that's also increasingly too climate sensitive. As far as natural disasters considered a major issue for environment and peace, yes. Some of the most interesting work is taking place looking at climate-related disasters, looking also at earthquakes. The case of Haiti is a really important case for generating lessons learned with the peacekeepers who brought cholera to Haiti. Aceh, the rebuilding there, and looking at the fisheries industry. And so really looking at how disasters can also provide opportunities for rebuilding in ways that fully engage the community and livelihood resources, and focusing very much on that human security dimension.
Okay, thank you, Erica. So it's I think a good response to the 2 questions. So I will give mic to another panelists. So who's going to be going first? Maybe Professor Otesser? Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm going to answer the question that was specifically for me, and then maybe a couple of questions from the chat, if that's okay. Okay, great. So there was a question, thank you, Il-Chong. How can we prevent peace-building processes from being hijacked by local elites in local-centered approaches? A question for Oliver and I. As for me, that's really where I see a role for outsiders. It's to make sure that all stakeholders are included, that all get the floor, that all are heard. And that's really when you think back about the stories I've told you about Vijaya and about the Life and Peace Institute and the Resolve Network, that's the kind of meetings that I was talking about, where outsiders did a lot of preparatory work for the LPI meeting that you remember the photo I showed you on the slide, the local partners actually did 3 years of preparatory work to make sure that everybody was included and that everybody would be heard and everybody would get to speak, and that the process wouldn't be hijacked by local elites. So I see a role for outsiders in that process, but for that we really need outsiders who have the legitimacy, the network, the resources, and most importantly, the local knowledge to make sure that local peace processes are not hijacked by local elites or by national elites or by anybody. And when I say local knowledge, I don't mean like someone who, for example, if she works on Congo, who speaks French and understands the history and culture of Congo. I mean the local knowledge, the knowledge of the specific village or province or district or territory, which we're talking about. So it means that these outsiders, the idea of sending someone from a capital city to a village on the other hand of the country where they don't have networks, they don't have legitimacy, and they have no knowledge of the rural village level issues, is not necessarily the solution. I really mean, again, outsiders, whether from the country or from outside of the same country, who do understand what is going on at the local level, so that then they can have a sense of what are the power relationships, and they can make sure that local elite, or whether, I mean, or maybe that's not formal elite, maybe it's just people who have some kind of power at the local level, to make sure that these people don't get to hijack the peace building process. And Professor Kim, if I have a few more minutes to answer a couple of other questions.
Yeah, maybe 2 minutes.
Yep. 2 more. Okay. So I'll take the question from Yuli Kim. What are ways to communicate and come to a mutual understanding about what peace means for Borderlands? Because I think it goes to the heart of what we've been talking during this panel. It's really clear that peace means different things for different people. Like all of our presentations touched on that, and Oliver and Professor Richmond has written a book that's fantastic on this topic. I think it's Peace in International Relations, Oliver. Anyway, peace means very different things for different people. And so, for instance, in my Frontlines of Peace book, I talk about these different definitions of peace as well. I give examples, like a woman saying, well, peace for me means that I can sleep in my bed wearing my pajamas. Because when it's war, and she's in Colombia, and she's one of the major most violent rebel held area. And she said, when it was war, I used to sleep fully dressed because I had to be able to get up in the middle of the night as soon as I heard something and run and hide. And now it's peace because I can sleep in my pajamas. And there are many other stories like that. So what to me is important is that we use the definition and the criteria of the people who actually live in the place where we're talking about peace or war or whatever. And that's when, again, the meetings that I've mentioned, the ones for which I showed you a photo from Congo, these meetings are really important because that's when people can agree or they can talk about their definition of peace and violence. And it's going to be a discussion that's going to be extremely contentious because, again, peace means different things for different people. So it's a contentious decision. It takes a lot of time. There are a lot of setbacks, but I think that's really, really important. And that's why I wanted to answer this question, because that's one of the first steps so that we can move forward. Before deciding how we're going to make peace, people need to decide what peace actually means for them in their local circumstances at this specific day and time. And a very brief answer to the question by Agnès Dur from Switzerland. How generalizable are the discussions to other regions and borderlands of the world? At least in my presentation, I try to make arguments that are fully generalizable. So you can remember the map I showed you of my research in conflict zones. It spans really different countries and continents, and like I made sure that I had a lot of variation in terms of the economic, political, geostrategic, security circumstances, etc. Okay. And also, as I mentioned, the lessons from conflict zones, and that's really important. The lessons from conflict zones also apply to places that we consider as ostensibly peaceful, like places like New York, where I live, or Paris, where I'm from, or Chicago. And I also have examples from a lot of other different countries like Mexico, Venezuela, etc. So I'm really trying to think of ideas that transcend just one tiny case like HW or Somaliland.
All right, thank you. Actually, I bought the book, the Professor Richmond's book, Peace in International Relations. So it's like my honor to see you today. All right, so do you have like the 9 minutes? So I think the Professor Hudson and Professor Richmond, you can share like the 4 minutes each to respond some questions.
Thank you. May I go first? I'd like to respond to the question that was directed to me, Professor Kim. This question relates to the situation in the borderlands where you could end up going back to the state the way things were before the war, before the conflict started. And then you will have different kinds of masculinities being entrenched in that situation, despite the struggle. So all the good work has been undone. I think that is a fantastic question because it really speaks to the reality on the ground, that social structure in the borderlands, and it should be very carefully monitored. I often look at the situation in Uganda, for instance, the Karamoja, and many interesting case studies there, where we've seen that it's very easy to change behavior, but it's not that easy to change norms. Those norms remain deep-seated and fundamental. International donor organizations can come in and say, well, let's get the men involved and let's stop them from working with cattle and give them chickens, but not understanding the cultural practices. They will still end up sleeping under the trees and the women will do the work because it is considered culturally inferior for men in certain cultures to work with chickens and not with cows that depict the wealth issues. So in those type of situations, one would like to become aware of these norms and then identify in those communities those people who can actually help transform the norms. Of course, it's not an overnight situation. I think that the question that also is posed, part of that is this, the position of women and taking a political position and the solidarity. I come with a different kind of approach from the African context, where I've been doing work on Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the African philosophy that says, I am because we are. So I'm never alone. I'm never an individual in the Western-centric idea of understanding. So it's always about community. It's about eating together and inviting people into your home. Interesting phenomenon what COVID has done to that notion of Ubuntu, but that's just an aside. So in a different notion of feminist Ubuntu or Ubuntu feminism, the idea is not to oppose men in that situation, but to rather get men to work together around a common goal. Now, I think that if you come from a Western or Eurocentric perspective, one would say that this is a co-option that you are selling out. But in that context, it's about female solidarity and the use of women's movements in a resourceful way, in a pragmatic way, in order to create a kind of a solidarity that goes beyond just around women, but that it includes gender. Maybe one could also say that Ubuntu has not been very friendly to gender, but those are the issues that one will have to navigate. And it boils down to the issue of relationships with donors in those communities, the local contestation, and the fact that women often, if they form part of NGOs, for instance, and they get donor funding to work on women's issues in that area, that they can then gain status in the local community with the chiefs, and that leads to very difficult situations that need to be navigated. So what I see here is not a unified taking a political stand against a particular position, but it's a complex navigation of different interests that need to be balanced, and the local situation is very, very volatile and fluid. You have to go with the fluidity. I think that maybe that's all I'd like to say at the moment. Yes, I think that I will conclude with that. But thank you for.
Thank you, Heidi. So the last but not the least. Okay, so Oliver, Professor Richmond, you can use 4 minutes. Unmute yourself, please. Unmute. Professor Richmond, unmute yourself. Okay.
The question of power relations, which infuse peace praxis, whether it's power relations relating to gender or ethnic or nationalistic inequalities or internal, I think is one that we really haven't got to grips with. You know, we tend to work with power relations. That's why we have this liberal democratic trading piece. It maintains many of the hierarchies of the international system and requires conflict-affected states and citizens to fit into those hierarchies. And if we look at the Human Development Index over time, you can see that most conflict-affected countries don't move very far up. So it's not just that we have frozen peace processes and frozen peacekeeping, but we have frozen developmental processes too. And it also seems from a lot of the local and subaltern data that we've been amassing that we have subaltern societal stratifications. Now that points to, as far as I can see, to a problem of governments at the state level and at the international level. That the refined checks and balances on power, the problems in accountability, not necessarily the lack of accountability, but the many problems of accountability, the implementation of law, the expansion of rights, these aren't being reflected in revised and reformed international systems to the degree that we would expect. Now, I think that is suggestive of that time lag that I was suggesting that has long existed earlier between the production of these scripts, which lay out a narrative about power relations, about how it is to live on the receiving end of war, violence and conflict, and the revision of international governance, institutions, of the donor and NGO system, and of the modern state framework itself. So this is about constructing new forms of polity. And it's pretty clear, I think, that teasing away at these inequalities and unsustainabilities in terms of a piece connected to anthropocenic renderings of politics is where we are heading next. So in that next layer, these are the sorts of issues that we are going to have to deal with if we are to retain the political legitimacy amongst societies, which is required to maintain political authority. Without political authority, we can't have peace and order. So these are fairly simple historical lessons. I think we kind of keep relearning them And every time we go through them, we realize that rights are expanding and therefore government is becoming more complex. And as it becomes more complex, and as rights expand, and I think as we see from a lot of the localized data that you've all, my participants, my colleagues referred to, it actually represents more of a challenge to political elites and to entrenched power structures, whether it's colonialism and imperialism, stratifications in society or in the global economy. As we challenge the power structures that block peace and its sophistication and evolution more, that means that we are raising the ire of power. And I think that probably points to the fact that the frozen nature of so many peace practices, peace processes, and conflict-affected societies today are frozen, not just because we failed to develop in policy terms and conceptually, because I think we have been developing, but they're frozen because what I'd like to call a counter-peace process has become more effective. That's a kind of reactionary process where the sorts of concessions that power must give at every level for peace and political order to be maintained and extended, made more sophisticated and more inclusive, are being rejected in subtle ways, leaving us in this kind of fine balance between war and no war in so many situations. So we have to engage with that problem of power relations through the peace process and the kinds of tactics that power would use to avoid giving concessions while also maintaining the benefits of the peace process. And I don't think we've been a bit naive about that dynamic, I think, in a lot of peace building policy and a lot of the theory and academic writing. We've tended to assume that peace processes don't work because we haven't listened enough to the local, because we've made mistakes, and because our systems, our theoretical and analytical systems aren't good enough. And that creates a bit of a vacuum or a lacuna, a dark space, if you like, on the other side about what the opposition is. And I think the opposition to peace, the anti-peace process is just as sophisticated, it's just as complex, it's just as deeply embedded, and it's mobilizing and organizing and refining itself. But we don't tend to see it in those sorts of terms. We tend to see it in a much more disaggregated way. So peace process failed because of mistakes, isolated incidents of violence, accidents, bad timing, bad synchronization and organization. When in fact, all of those things are also a systematic attempt to oppose the kinds of compromises, the loss of privilege, and so on, that peace processes entail for many. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you again. Right, so it's a pity because, yeah, I know that you have the many things, many points to share, but the time is always like limited. So sorry about it. And also, I'm going to complete the finish up to today's session 2, by throwing out the my personal question to all of you, but you don't have to answer because we don't have time. So COVID-19, right? So it's kind of pandemic. So yeah, it's a new normal period. So probably your presentation today are not include that factor. The COVID-19. So probably this is another watershed where each different topic could be reshuffled, right? So probably we're gonna have the next session. Next round. So I look forward to having another opportunity to invite all of you for another session. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, right? Good evening. So for me, good night. So it's heading towards already the 3 minutes over 12. Okay, so yeah, I would say take care, and then please be healthy and safe under the COVID-19 in handling that. So thank you today, and then take care. Oh, I forgot the one thing. Because I got the notice from the staff organizers. Actually, as a final stage, participants from the online or the offline, we prepared the 3-question feedback survey. It is like on YouTube channel, so you can fill that form and then submit that survey to the secretariat. So it is good kind of asset to review our performance today. So thank you. Take care. I'll finish up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Well, thank you, and we would all love to have you back. In particular, thank you to Taekyun Kim, the professor who moderated session 2, and all the presenters for the wonderful discussion. Well, that's it for session 2, and also the first day of the conference. It's getting quite late here. It's a little after midnight here in Korea. But tomorrow is another day, and we have session 3 at 10 a.m. Korea time, and the topic is diverse approaches to harmony with nature in the context of peacemaking in borderlands. So please come back, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.